Okay, so this is going to torque some people off, but been there before, so let's go over it. Let's talk about the history of telling time. Now, I think most people are aware that back in literally the beginning of time, so to speak, people had sundials. You know, sun, shadow onto a circular platform. That would actually make a shadow you could track the hours in the day. And in the night, if you're curious, they did have things like hourglasses and even water vessels that would help track the hours when there was no sun. So that worked great for millennia, pretty much all the way up through the Renaissance era. Then we have the thing called a clock tower, first mechanical clock. That was about 1270, if you're curious about that. And that would be setting up a clock in the town that basically was the timepiece for the town. Got to keep in mind at this time, people aren't jet setting, people aren't traveling that far every day. Quite honestly, if you could figure out a uniform standard of time that would handle your village and maybe be able to keep track of time a couple villages over, you're doing pretty good. All right. Now, an interesting thing comes up about 500 years later, around 1730, when we're coming up with the age of sail. And this is when, the major powers, England, France, Spain, Dutch, they're really starting to get around the globe, and they need not even so much a way to tell the time of day, but because of navigation reasons, they need a way to track their latitude better. Okay, from things like even the North Star, figuring out longitude, that's pretty easy, but latitude is all relative to sunrise and sunset, so to speak. This is also how time zones get into the equation. So the actual Royal Observatory finally set up a chronometer. They actually developed a device that was capable of keeping time on the sway and rock of the ships. Essentially, they figured out how to do it with springs instead of weights. The history of the chronometer, really good read if you're interested in this level of detail. But anyway, that finally set up an accurate mechanical clock that they could actually travel over the seas and even over land. And what would happen is, it would be very common for ships like in the Thames around 1300, 1 p.m. to watch the Royal Observatory for them to raise the ball at, like I said, 1 p.m., 1300, and they would set their shipboard clocks accordingly, so they all had a universal time of what the time was back in, England. And then when they're sailing and such, at 12 noon their local time, because you can tell that again from shadow, they could then compare what the local time was compared to what the English time was, and they would know exactly how far, hours and minutes west or east of England they were. Now, I set that up as a framework to give you an idea of central clock sending that message outwards. That works pretty well for hundreds of years because we now have mechanical clocks that can travel. And that's kind of how it works for quite a long time as we're developing through. The next major development comes when we finally get things like radio. And through radio transmission, we now have much faster, much further communication. And as we're doing radio shows and news shows, they would actually tell the time, thus sending the transmission of what time it is over an even greater distance. And then that was followed up with news, television, news doing the same thing. When we started to have telephones, especially automatic phones, like in the 70s and 80s, there would be phone numbers you could actually call and to say the time is 1300 on the beep, beep, and that would give that as well. So that's all examples of how that would go out. Now, coming from a rural Midwestern experience, I will further tell you that, remember the concept we told you about the Royal Observatory sending up balls at 1300? I can tell you for a fact, growing up in Midwestern Iowa, at 12 noon, most every day, the alarms would sound. They would be the same alarms they would use for any sort of emergency like tornadoes, but they would give off a singular tone, whistling out at 12 noon. And that was to tell all the farmers in the field it's time to go home to get lunch. In fact, in a lot of places, you could actually hear 2 or 3 sirens from the 2 or 3 circling towns. And a couple minutes later, you'd hear a lot of tractors firing up to go wherever they needed to go for lunch. So that's just yet another example of how these things transmit. Now, all of this is an example of I posted a joke. I didn't even say anything. Someone asked a question of how did they tell accurate time back in the day? And I held up a wristwatch. And to date, that video has about somewhere around over 5,000 views. So this is my little social experiment. I posted a joke less than 30 seconds. I got over 5,000 views in under a week. This is a thought out, clear explanation of the original question. And I'm curious to see how far it travels. And I'm just curious if the algorithm is really more interested in sending out, educating good information to people, or if they're just into quick bite entertainment. Because I'm willing to bet within the week which one's going to have more views. And I'm willing to adjust for the head start the first joke video had. If you want to make a positive impact, go ahead and share this out with other people to get a head start. If you're interested in entertaining stuff like this, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'm Commander Tom. I'll see you next time. Thanks.